Welcome back to the Global Landscapes Forum here in Bonn 2019, where we are focusing on rights in the landscape. This is day 2 of a 2-day weekend where we've been discussing the environment and the links between indigenous rights, community rights, women's rights to preserving our environment. And this afternoon, I have the pleasure of speaking with Tristan Ahtone, who is the president of the Native American Journalists Association. He's also from the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma. And the Native American Journalists Association is an organization that works to empower indigenous journalists, defend free press, and advocate for ethical indigenous coverage for mainstream media. I'm told you're also a writer, reporter, and rabble-rouser.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. So tell us, what's the biggest story about rights at the moment?
Generally,
or I mean, I guess it's all about rights.
I think all of it is about rights. I mean, it depends on where you are in the world. Obviously, in the U.S., I think when looking at rights, that can come in a lot of different forms, from access to health care to being able to have any sort of tribal jurisdiction over crimes that are committed in Indian country. So there are a lot of different stories. They just take on a lot of different flavors and complexions depending on where you are.
Okay, and to tell us a bit more about your organization and what your organization does and why it's important.
Well, Native American Journalists Association works to empower Native reporters, make sure that we can get indigenous reporters into mainstream newsrooms, as well as defending free press in Indian country. There are essentially no free press laws in indigenous communities in the U.S., so we work to support tribal media outlets and make sure that they can be providing news and information that's going to be important to tribal citizens. Okay,
and so what are the challenges that you face in terms of, like, you know, putting rights of indigenous people at the forefront of this climate crisis? What are like some of the challenges of, you know, making sure that, you know, rights are put at the forefront? Because normally it's like the rights of indigenous people are sidelined.
Well, I think when it comes to just general coverage, I mean, rights are sort of always at the forefront with a lot of the conflicts that we see. So I wouldn't say it's something that, you know, we're consciously putting forward, but it's continuing attacks on indigenous rights that often come up in our coverage. So I couldn't say that it was something conscious that a lot of reporters are doing, but it is something that we see a lot in terms of what we're reporting on.
Okay. And in terms of reporting in the media, I mean, I don't think the media really covers in general, you know, rights of indigenous people enough. What's your opinion on that?
Well, media doesn't cover indigenous people enough generally. So, so rights on top of that, yes, minuscule.
Right. And what are we doing to change this?
Well, that's working with training the next generation of reporters that they can work in mainstream newsrooms, making sure that our reporters and tribal outlets are feeling confident about the work that they do and feeling supported as well. So it's making sure that there's a good infrastructure there to support Native reporters in whatever area they are in their career, whatever time they are in their career, to be able to do the work that's important to their communities.
Great. So like, what are some of the most challenging things that you have, you know, maybe in your past, like had to report on in terms of rights of indigenous people? Like, any stories you want to share that?
I think when it comes to a lot of the coverage in the past that I've done when it comes to rights is looking at just how those rights violations sort of manifest in different communities. So again, that can be anything from criminal jurisdiction to pipelines or missing and murdered indigenous women. You know, all of these are sort of kind of come in the Venn diagram of when you're looking at like human rights, indigenous rights, colonialism, culture. That's kind of the sweet spot, I guess, to some degree that we're looking at when it comes to stories and making sure that we can provide the right context for readers to sort of understand why it's important and what the bigger picture is when it comes to rights and violation of human rights.
Okay. But in terms of, like, you know, getting rights to be reported in the media, what more needs to be done? Do you think?
It just needs to be more diversity in media. I mean, bottom line is there needs to be more people of color, more people from LGBTQ individuals. There just needs to be a diversity of people working in mainstream media. You know, without diversity in the newsroom, you don't have a diversity of stories, thoughts, opinion, etc. It's, you know, pretty one-dimensional most of the time. So really on our end, it's always advocating for diversity in newsrooms so that people from backgrounds that understand that human rights, indigenous rights, et cetera, are important to be reporting on, are represented in the newsroom.
And I learned about this phrase called ethno media the other day about people telling their own stories from the ground up, like telling their own stories. How is that working with the Native Americans or indigenous people in the States? Taking their own stories and telling them. Is there a growing movement? Are things changing? What can you tell us about how your people are telling their stories themselves?
Sure. I mean, there are over 200 tribal media outlets in the U.S. I guess it would fall under ethno media, ranging from television and radio to print to newsletters. So I wouldn't say that it's a growing. I take that back. It's an area that's receiving a lot more support these days, but it's an area that's always been there. So it's always been sort of the golden age for indigenous media in the United States. It just takes on different forms at different times. But storytelling, reporting, those have always been integral to indigenous communities. It may look a little bit different in different times, but it's sort of the backbone of who we are. So.
Okay, and then so why are rights important in terms of reporting the environment?
I mean, I guess I can't say because I can't necessarily say because I work as a reporter, but usually environmental stories from indigenous communities have a component of rights that have to be covered. So I guess what's important about covering rights is that you have to understand what those rights are. So again, that comes down to diversity in the newsroom and reporters that are well versed in how rights work, and especially in regards to environment.
Okay. So you've been here at the GLF for the past 2 days. Could you give some any important takeaways that you've learned since you've been here? Have there been? It's been sort of fascinating to sort of understand how the international community is working to deal with conservation and land rights. But the fact that we're actually focusing on rights, in the landscape, which is something I guess quite new and important. So what do you feel about that? Having a conference surrounding, or focusing on rights in the landscape.
I mean, I think it's great that there's a conference that's looking at it. I guess some of my big questions have been how rights can actually be advocated for when it's operating in capitalism. That seems to be a pretty big area that I'm hearing in conversation here, is how you fund and support conversation through a system that relies on capitalism and then trying to get rights in there. Those two things clash, it seems to me, but I need to do some more reporting before I can make that claim.
Okay, no problem. So just in terms of for the future, forward-looking. So, I mean, I guess the question is how do we secure rights in terms of landscapes? Do you have any opinion on that? How, in terms of reporting, I guess we need to report more about rights in order to secure them.
I guess where I'm coming from as a journalist is that in order to be reporting on rights and getting those stories out, is that activists, advocates, financiers, etc., need to be interfacing with reporters a lot more. There's a lot of interesting stories here, a lot of interesting people doing interesting work. And I think these are stories that people around the world would like to hear, be it success stories or be it investigative work, to find where, how funding works and whether or not it's actually successful. So, when it comes to reporting on rights, it depends on the source and reporter relationship, and just like to see a lot more.
Okay, great. So, I mean, I think that's been a great interview. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add that maybe I haven't asked you about that you think is important you'd like to share with us in terms of media and reporting on indigenous rights or local communities that maybe I've missed.
No, I guess I just advocate to develop relationships with reporters. Be safe in your communications with reporters and other individuals. Build those relationships so you can get your stories out and let people know about what you're up to.
Yeah, and I mean, one more question now that you've spoken about it. Is it dangerous reporting on indigenous rights? Is it like a dangerous arena, or are you finding it's okay?
It depends on where you are in the world, but we see no matter where you are in the world that there is a real danger in being monitored by law enforcement, corporations, etc. And keeping some good security protocols in place is really a safe thing to do. In the U.S., for instance, jail time is something that you may be looking at. In other parts of the world, it's outright murder. And people need to be safe and be aware.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
And wish you a lovely rest of your weekend.
Thanks.
Cheers.